Welcome to Satisfaction Factor, the podcast where we explore how ditching diet culture makes our whole lives more satisfying. Welcome back, everybody. I am Naomi Katz, an intuitive eating, body image, and self-trust coach providing anti-diet support to free-thinking grown-ups who want to reclaim their autonomy and consent from diet culture.
I'm Sadie Simpson, an anti-diet group fitness instructor and intuitive eating counselor, and I help other fitness professionals disengage from diet culture so they can improve their program enrollment, engagement, impact, and retention without shame and manipulation.
Hey, Sadie.
Hey, Naomi.
We both specifically mentioned the phrase diet culture in our intros. And that's like a perfect segue into today's episode. We are going to talk today all about what diet culture is and the ways in which it is so much more than just diet.
And that ties perfectly into our theme of the Satisfaction Factor podcast, which is all about exploring how by disengaging from diet culture, we can get our own needs met, and how diet culture is not just about diets, but it manifests in literally every other aspect of our lives. So I'm excited to get into this topic today with you on this episode, because I think there's a lot about diet culture that people maybe misunderstand. And I think it's going to be interesting to kind of dig a little bit deeper into that today.
Yeah, definitely. You know, we're both intuitive eating professionals, and the first principle of intuitive eating is reject the diet mentality. And a lot of the work that we do in that principle is specifically talking about the ways in which actual diets have failed us. But another big part of the work that we do is really investigating the ways that diet culture has found its way into the other areas of our lives, the areas that have nothing to do with food or weight loss or our bodies. I mean, everything has to do with our bodies because we live life in our bodies, but the appearance of our bodies, I guess, is a better way to say that.
Yeah. And I think the first thing we really need to hit on is something that you've talked a lot about in your Instagram post, and really honestly something that I've learned a lot from you, is that being anti-diet culture is a lot different than being anti-dieter. So talk a little bit more about that. Since you are the one who kind of educated me on this, why don't you educate everybody else a little bit on this?
Yeah, I would love to. Also, thank you for that.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of times when people hear anti-diet, it's really easy to think that what we're talking about is anti-people who diet. And it's really not that. It's anti-diet culture, not anti-dieters. An example of this, and this is really what got me started talking about this whenever I started talking about this a while back. I am a member of a Facebook group that in general is, very body positive. I don't know to the extent I feel like it's radically body positive, but it is at least, let's take the focus off of weight loss and, let's take the focus off of how our bodies look. And it's definitely meant to be more of a body inclusive type of a space. Having said that, it's a very, very, very large group. And so a lot of people end up in this group asking for essentially dieting advice, or even celebrating things that are quote unquote non-scale victories, but still have a lot to do with the appearance of their bodies. So things like the size of their pants, or something like that, where it's yeah, you weren't on a scale, but clearly this is still about the changing the size of your body. So whatever, things like that. And more and more, I was seeing that these people would come in and be asking a question, and other people would gang up on them basically and tell them how wrong it was for them to want what they wanted and then be asking the questions they were asking.
The internet is so brutal.
It really is. And, you know, we'll get into some of the nuances of this about how dieting behaviors and dieting talk are not necessarily neutral acts, but ultimately, like, these people weren't being, like, nobody was helping these people. Like, they weren't getting the answer to their question, which, okay, maybe the answer to their question wasn't ultimately going to be helpful either. But they also weren't getting any kind of entry point into a different perspective outside of the framework of dieting. Instead, it was just this, like, toxic, I don't know, it felt very problematic to me. So I just started kind of thinking about that a lot, and like how important it is to separate diet culture from dieters in terms of how we respond to it. And I think a lot of that has to do with remembering that diet culture is a really, really, really big thing. It's not just diets. And so in order to be able to recognize the impact of diet culture, we have to actually recognize diet culture itself for what it is and how pervasive it is. David Foster Wallace, who is an awesome author and also a super problematic human. So just, you know, to recognize that. But he's got this quote. I think a lot of us have heard the phrase, like, diet culture is the water we swim in. And that's really, it comes from this quote from David Foster Wallace, where he basically tells this story. There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" And I love this quote because it's so representative of how diet culture functions in our lives, in that we don't even see it until someone who's maybe a little further along in their journey helps us to see it. Like, we're so in it, right?
Oh, man. It's one of those things, once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Yes.
But there's such a broad spectrum of understanding when it comes to diet culture. And when people even first hear the word or the phrase diet culture, like, it's a pretty radical, different idea and approach than what our society believes about health and wellness and fitness and nutrition and all this sort of stuff. When you start learning even just what the basics of diet culture is, it's different. So, like, I think I know what space you're talking about online, where you had
probably do.
Some of these conversations happen, because I believe I've seen some of these similar conversations just as a lurker. I like to lurk in a Facebook group. I don't really like to participate.
That is also my favorite way to participate in Facebook groups, as a lurker.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that is really helpful when we talk about, you know, what it means to be anti-diet culture as opposed to being anti-dieter is to look at both what we're against, but also what we are for as people who are in the anti-diet space. And we'll elaborate on some of this stuff in a minute when we, like, actually define diet culture. Being anti-diet culture means being against a culture that tells us there's only one right way to have a body, or that profits off our insecurities, that sells us harmful and ineffective products, and then also somehow manages to convince us that we're the problems and why those things are harmful and ineffective.
So basically, like, every mainstream diet program, product, etc., that's out there.
To sum up, yeah, exactly that. It's against a culture that pits us against each other and puts us in competition or comparison. It's a culture that prioritizes our appearance over every other part of our lives. It is a culture that ignores all the social and genetic reasons that we have different bodies and places all of the quote-unquote blame, because it's weird to say blame about a body size, but in this framework, they certainly consider it to be blame, that they're blaming it on lack of willpower and personal responsibility. And it's against a culture that really rests on things like fat phobia and healthism and ableism and racism and capitalism and all of these things.
All the isms.
All the isms, really, right?
Yeah.
And then again, sort of looking at the flip side of that, like, okay, if we're anti all of those things, what are we pro? Like, what are we for when we're in this anti-diet space? And what we're pro is compassion, informed choices, autonomy, true community, inclusion, and supporting individuals at their different points in this journey. And I think that really sums up why it's not helpful to go down this rabbit hole of like demonizing people who still haven't seen the water, to carry out the metaphor.
Yeah. Yes.
because that's not compassion. That's not, supporting. That's not giving support to them where they're at. And so, yeah, it's not super helpful. It's one thing to be a person who diets, and it's another thing to be a person who constantly talks about their body or their diets or whatever, that becomes more problematic and less of a neutral thing to meet with compassion and support. But somebody who is just in that space still and hasn't found their way out of it, we're not helping them by just trash talking them.
Yeah, well, I think to kind of divide that out, like what anti-diet culture means versus what we are for and what we are against and that type of thing is a really helpful way to break it down, especially for somebody, again, who is either new to learning about diet culture, or for those of us even who have been doing this work for a while, clarifying that the alternative is being pro-people, basically, is a big deal. And putting a lot of blame and shame on people who just don't know any better isn't going to help anybody out. You know what I mean? Like, and that's kind of the case in a lot of situations, but especially whenever we're talking about this specific topic of diet culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to carry out this whole concept of how these things apply way outside of dieting and food and body is like, those are specific examples that we'll talk more about in more depth later about how divesting from diet culture allows us to see those kinds of structures in other areas too, much like we can see it here.
Yes. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking, what are they even talking about? We're going to break it down for you really quickly here. So diet culture is a system that idolizes thinness. It equates health to morality and to goodness. It promotes weight loss as a way to attain a higher social status and demonize certain ways of eating while elevating others. And I think the big thing to point out about diet culture is that it oppresses people who don't necessarily match up to what we view as the healthy ideal. And I always do air quotes when we record this, but nobody can see what I'm doing. But this idea of diet culture and how it oppresses people who don't match up with this thin or this beautiful or this healthy or this fit ideal, it disproportionately harms people who do not match up to this ideal. So women, femmes, trans folk, people in larger bodies, people of color, people without financial privilege, and people with disabilities are a couple of examples of folks who are disproportionately harmed by the systems that diet culture upholds.
Yeah, and just to sort of add on to that, we're probably not going to do a super deep dive into specifically how those systems play out in diet culture, because as to people who are pretty close to those societal standards, we're probably not the best people to speak to that. But if you go back and check the show notes for episode number 1, we included a whole bunch of resources and people that we have personally learned from about how those systems intersect here. So make sure you go check that out, as opposed to having us be the voices of that for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Personally, I have a tendency to use diet culture as this like umbrella term that for everything that, tells us, like, again, that there's a wrong way to have a body, or that makes us feel unsafe in our bodies as they are. So diet culture is a system of oppression. And it also, for me, when I say diet culture, I am also referring to all the other systems of oppression that uphold and are being upheld by diet culture. Like I said, we've named a lot of those already, and those are definitely things that there are better people to speak about in detail than us. But again, when we say diet culture is more than diets, I think it's helpful. I think a lot of times, for instance, when I first start talking to people about diet culture, they don't really get that when I say diet culture, I literally mean all the systems. Yes. So it's like, it's like shorthand for me when I talk about it. So.
In addition to that, diet culture, despite all the harms that dieting does and all of the science and research and information we now have to support the fact that dieting just doesn't work, is the reason why we are so easily drawn back into this cycle of dieting. So basically, thanks to diet culture, this pursuit of an unattainable ideal body, so white, thin, lightly toned, able-bodied, conventionally pretty, is the pursuit of social acceptance, safety, and security, which it basically is the root of all the isms, to sum back up what you literally just said.
And it's because pursuing weight loss ultimately becomes this pursuit of these other things, these bigger things. It's almost like even when we're presented with all kinds of evidence and science about how dieting doesn't work and, intentional weight loss isn't sustainable or safe or effective or all of those things, that we still get drawn back into that dieting cycle because we're not really pursuing any of those things that science says isn't attainable through dieting. We're pursuing all of these other things. And sometimes just the act of dieting gets us closer to those things.
Yes. So that's why rejecting the diet mentality, divesting from diet culture, it's never really just about the diet. It's not just saying, oh, I'm done dieting. I'm never dieting again. That's definitely a part of it. But it also has to be about all of the peripheral systems that the diets are holding.
Yeah, for sure. And there's like a million examples of how diet culture shows up in our lives and our thinking processes and all of that stuff that far exceeds like actually am I on a diet or am I not on a diet. One of I think the most pervasive ways that diet culture seeps into the rest of our lives is black and white, all or nothing, either or binary thinking patterns.
Yes.
And I have definitely read some very educational and helpful takes on how that is also an offshoot of white supremacy. And so, again, go check those show notes from episode 1 because some of the people that are cited there are some of the people who have spoken about that. But, it gets us in this place of just having to choose either or for things that more often than not are actually both and. Where it's not that one thing's true and one thing's false. It's like, hey, both of these things are actually kind of true, even though it's a little uncomfortable to recognize that. I'm going to share sort of a weird little story of how this played out for me recently. And it's actually, I love this story because it is so illustrative of how I often approach like body image discomfort with people. So I hate spiders. I'm not okay with spiders at all.
It's okay. Me either.
Like a couple of weeks ago, I guess, this large spider spun herself a web on the outside of our basement door and was just hanging in the center of it, right in the middle of that like basement window. And oh my gosh, it freaked me out so badly. But that also happens to be the door that like we let our dog out in and out of the backyard from. And it's also like the window that's right there in the area where we work out in our basement and stuff. So like I couldn't just ignore this spider.
It was there.
It was
like clear and present danger.
It was a big part of our lives for a while.
You had a new pet.
Yeah. Thank you. But what I found was that I was able to sort of go through this both and thinking process. And as a result, like, you know, my husband did offer to go out there and like relocate the spider, but like I felt really bad about that. And so basically I found myself being able to observe my thought process and be like, okay, this spider makes me feel very uncomfortable. I am scared and uncomfortable about this spider. And what I know is true in addition to that is this spider is on the outside, not the inside. This spider is harmless. This is not a poisonous spider. This is not a spider who's going to like aggressively attack me or anything like that. But mostly the spider wants to be left alone. The spider is good for the environment. And we have a mosquito issue that this spider was probably helping with a lot.
Oh, yeah.
You know, that all in all, my discomfort, I don't need to bypass my discomfort. I don't have to pretend to be comfortable about it. And I can recognize what's actually so in the moment. And as a result, I don't have to act on that discomfort.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Well, first, I appreciate that you said your husband was going to relocate the spider, because this whole time I was thinking, I like to view myself as like a very independent, strong woman, but when it comes to spiders, or if there's bugs or anything like that in the house, like I just can't. I have to ask my husband to deal with it. That is not my my strength or my area of expertise in this family, and I'm okay with that. But I love that story and the idea of the shift from this binary and linear way of thinking to accepting the fact that this thing, the spider, is on the outside, and you like consciously know it is not going to hurt you. It's out there. It's probably helping you more than it's hurting you. But there's always this fear of, oh crap, what if it does get to me? What's going to happen? Knowing good and well that that spider ain't going to get anywhere near you. And I think that is so relative, like to talking about diet culture, and especially for people who are just in the beginning stages of learning about diet culture and things like intuitive eating and just all of those similar concepts. It seems like this really big, scary thing on the outside, and we don't exactly know what to do with it.
Yeah, no, that's all very true. And I think, you know, we have a lot of examples of how like all or nothing thinking shows up and can be dismantled in the context of exercise, for instance, is a great example of that. Like there's so many great accounts out there who talk about letting go of that all or nothing concept in fitness, doing things that just feel good and redefining what quote unquote counts, and like recognizing that there's, you know, some instead of everything and all of that stuff. Ditto for food and all of that stuff. And I think it's a lot harder to see, like, what does it look like to let go of either or binary thinking outside of the context of those things? Like, yes. And it's like, no, actually, that is affecting so much.
Yes. That's a really good point. And even thinking back to our conversation on last week's episode about what we talked a little bit about what has changed in your life as a result of disengaging from diet culture. And I feel like the whole concept of the black and white, all or nothing thinking was a big, big, big thing for me on a personal level is once I was able to let go of that binary thinking with eating and exercise, that I had to look this one specific way, that opened the door to thinking about everything in life, which we're talking about right now. It just opened the door to kind of using this and sort of thinking with pretty much everything, because there's always multiple factors that feed into any situation. And I think that that's a perfect example of how diet culture is more than just diets.
Yeah, definitely. I guess another one is this sort of concept of like us versus them, or like in-group, out-group mentality that shows up a lot in diet culture. So there is a book, and I'm kicking myself right now because I cannot remember the name of the author. But there's a book called The Gluten Lie, and it's written by a man who sort of his whole thing is exploring how things almost become like religions to us. And so sort of examining diet culture through this lens of it as a religion. Fascinating concept, right? Mm-hmm. And you can really see how that plays out in diet culture, where it's like the keto folks versus the low-fat folks.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Right? Weight Watchers versus Noom. I don't know. Like so many, paleo versus
vegetarian.
Right, exactly. Like,
oh my gosh, yes.
And it becomes this way to be like, who's on our side and who isn't.
Yep.
And also a way to, I don't know, almost like claim superiority over those who are not in our group.
Oh man, yes. And you see that manifest in so many other areas. I'm even thinking like coming from the fitness world, I'm going to say it, but the CrossFit people.
I knew what you were going to say.
Get mad at me for saying that. But yes, like with CrossFit, that is a notoriously, I want to say elite. What's the word I'm looking for? It's an
exclusive.
Yeah. It feels very exclusive, and people who CrossFit, you know they do CrossFit because we talk about it all the time. But I have definitely been in circles of people being in the fitness industry that if it's not CrossFit, or if it's not high intensity strength training, interval training, that sort of thing, that it's just, it doesn't matter. It's not worth it if it can't be this super extreme type of thing. So I think that's a perfect example of this like us versus them and versus out group, especially in the fitness world. And that can be, I'm not trying to pick on CrossFit if anybody is a CrossFit person. I'm not picking on you. It's just it's an easy example, but the same could be said for other modalities of fitness, even in the yoga world, or in the running world, or the cycling world, or anything else for that matter. Sometimes there's this us versus them and versus out group mentality that comes along with all of these things, I feel like.
Yeah, I think what it sort of boils down to is taking personal experience and making it prescriptive. Yes. So like, it doesn't even matter. Like, okay, so you like CrossFit. I am so glad that you found something you like and that you want to do. Enjoy that. Nobody's saying you shouldn't do it. But turning it into this prescription where everybody else should also be doing it based on your own personal experience. Or that if they're doing something else that they enjoy, that it's somehow less than. That's where we come into it. It's the same as, again, referencing that book, The Gluten Lie. Like, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with being gluten-free, if that's, especially if you have celiac disease, like that's fine. Like these are choices for you. And that doesn't mean that everybody else should also be doing it because of your personal experience. I think, again, this is it's very similar to the dieter concept, where it's like there's autonomy and then there's the stuff that outwardly impacts others. And again, that's a big concept, so we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I think that comes into play here too, like thinking that our own personal experience is somehow the quote unquote right thing to do for everyone.
You know how else this shows up? I know a lot of the examples that we talked about already were more directly related to eating and exercise, but man, like this is the perfect example of how the online business world works too.
Oh my God, yes.
Because we have all these gurus and these experts that try to teach you how to run a successful online business because this figurehead has made this much amount of money by doing this system and marketing their programs this way. And then they go forth and teach all these other people how to make all this money and sell all these programs and stuff. And it turns almost into this elitism as well. And this idea of if you don't run your business in a certain way, then you are less than me. Like you are not as good as I am in this facet. And it's interesting to see even the parallels between this factor, but just diet culture in general compared to the online business world. I feel like we should probably do a whole episode about
Oh my God, we absolutely could. And I totally know who we're going to invite to be a guest, but we're not going to say it out loud right now because obviously. But yeah, and I think a lot of that, like a similar problem, like one of the reasons why that's a problem in both spaces and why it's generally a problem to assume that your personal experience can be prescriptive is that we don't necessarily, we're not taking into account all of the intersecting identities and privileges and social structures that may make my experience very different from somebody else's experience. And that's true in health and fitness and food and all of that and bodies and whatever, just as much as it is in like business.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Well, and with parenting, I know that's more of my wheelhouse in this duo right now, but I'd always heard, like prior to becoming a parent, you always read people posting things online on Instagram and Facebook and stuff about all the mommy bashing and that sort of thing. I was like, that's so stupid. Like, what are they talking about? Until I became a parent and then realized, oh, this is a very real thing that happens with this same type of us versus them mentality with how you raise your kids, with all of these different factors that I had never even considered prior to becoming a parent that people just get all up in arms about, like whether you bed share or you put your baby in a crib when they first come home from the hospital. I didn't know that was a conflicting thing. Or formula feeding versus breastfeeding, or how you feed your toddler if you let them have juice and cookies versus if you only let them have water and vegetables. And there's this whole camp of mommy elitism things out there that I didn't even know existed. And it's interesting to see this play out because it all feeds back into diet culture and this idea that the right way is my way, but it doesn't take your lived experiences or your preferences or your cultural background into account. And it's wild. It's just a whole weird world I didn't even know was a thing until I had to experience it.
I'm so glad you brought that up because, yeah, that's not something that I have any personal experience with, but I've definitely seen it, like, from the outside, and it's exactly this, like, us versus them mentality.
Moms are brutal, too. I know we said the internet's brutal. Moms can be brutal, too.
I think really the answer is that, like, diet culture is brutal. And actually, even, like, higher level than that, it's, like, problematic systems like capitalism and whatever are brutal. And just,
it all trickles down and it just shows up in so many unexpected ways.
Yeah, absolutely, that is true. And it's interesting. I think that one of the things that we're sort of seeing when we see that happening is the way, so diet culture has a really significant impact on our ability to trust ourselves. Diet culture has a really significant impact on our self-trust. where it tells us a lot that what we're doing, that what feels right to us personally, is somehow wrong. It does a lot of, like, no, you can't trust yourself, you need to control yourself, right? Yes. Sadie is nodding at me, like her eyes just got really big. But yeah, it doesn't matter if you feel hungry. Your hunger is supposed to be controlled. It doesn't matter if your body feels better doing yoga. You'll control it better with CrossFit, just to carry out that competition a little bit further. Things like that. And then even like smaller things like, there's a real stupid diet culture truism out there, basically, that like if you feel hungry, you're probably really thirsty, and that like you should just drink water or something like that. And so it does this thing where it's like you don't really know what's best for you. You don't even really know if you're hungry or you're thirsty. And so if you don't know those things, like what are the chances you really know what works best for you?
And I think that's something, we've talked about this before whenever we've worked with our intuitive eating coaching clients. That is something that a lot of people come to us. It's a big struggle of not being able to recognize hunger and fullness, and just to be able to understand those bodily cues. I feel like that is something that we've seen a lot within our coaching clients and the people that we work with, is doing some of this work to be able to trust ourselves a little bit more, and to not feel like an outside source has to control what we eat and what we drink and when we eat and all of that stuff.
Yeah, and we even see that in terms of how we allow ourselves to recognize, let alone meet our needs. One of the things that I see coming up with folks a lot as they like divest from diet culture is that they start to be able to recognize that they have a need, but there's like this societal messaging that is like preventing them from actually getting that need met. So, when I'm talking to people about self-care and like managing their stress and things like that, and they tell me things about how, one of the things that stresses them out the most is that their family doesn't clean up after themselves. And the more we talk about it, the more we realize that like the thing that's holding them back from just saying, hey, y'all, can maybe you clean up after yourselves? Because I don't have the capacity to do it all myself. Are like societal tropes like being a nagging wife or like something like that. And so it's really interesting to see how these societal expectations make us second guess not just our intuition and our instincts and, our self-trust and all of that, but also like our needs and whether or not those needs are valid and whether we deserve to have them met in the first place.
Can we talk for a minute about how that really ties into work culture and corporate culture too? Because I feel like that is really relative here, especially when we're talking about second guessing ourselves and having self-trust and self-control, because it's really common in the corporate world and in the nonprofit world and pretty much in any like sector when you have to work with other people and you have a supervisor and a team and that sort of thing, that there's this idea that every organization and every business wants to attract really great staff, and they want to have a staff team of good morale and all this sort of stuff. And they want to promote work-life balance and job satisfaction and all these sort of things. But when it boils down to it, our corporations and our jobs, they say one thing, but they really want another. And I think this is a really good example of how kind of diet culture kind of manifests in work culture as well, because it kind of sets us up in this situation to where we try to meet these standards of what our supervisor, what our boss, or what our job is telling us to do. But during that time, we are not advocating for ourselves, and we're not getting our needs met, and we're working ourselves to death. And there's this weird imbalance that sometimes gets created between work and life. Like, not to be super cliche, like there's really no such thing as work-life balance. And I guess, I don't know, it just made me kind of think about that whenever you were talking about asking your family to clean up after themselves. How can we get to a point where we're asking our coworkers and our supervisors and our employers for support whenever we need support and we feel like we're drowning in a work situation? And I think this kind of ties back into this whole second guessing ourselves and our needs, because, like, especially in a work situation, you almost feel like you can't ask for help or you're going to look like you can't do your job right.
Mm-hmm. So I think this is an excellent sort of demonstration of the ways that we can use diet culture as like an umbrella term, because like, yes. So for instance, the needy, the nagging wife trope that like I was talking about, and that family dynamic is definitely is actually, you know, misogyny and patriarchy, right? What you're talking about with like the work-life thing is totally capitalism. Yep. And the thing is that diet culture is representative and inclusive of both of those systems of oppression also. Yes. Which I think is a really great transition to also talk about one of the biggest things that shows up in diet culture, i.e. all these other systems, which is this sense that we are personally responsible for things that are actually the consequences of systemic inequity. So, for instance, like health, honestly, I think is probably the biggest one. We'll put a link in the show notes to an excellent site and a really great graphic illustration of the social determinants of health. So the social determinants of health are basically all the things that comprise our health as our individual health. And what's fascinating is, you know, we talk about health and we talk about diet and exercise and how like we are personally responsible for our health because diet and exercise. When you look at the social determinants of health, first of all, there is a section called personal responsibility or personal behavior, I think. And I think it makes up something like 35% of everything that actually results in your health. But even more than that, within that, that's all personal behavior. The part of that little personal behavior section that is diet and exercise is like 10% or something like that. Yep. Everything else that makes up our health are things like, you know, our income, our access to healthcare, our, you know, the environment that we like, the actual physical environment that we're exposed to, safety, things like wearing a seatbelt or being around guns or drugs or mental health. Like there's so many things. It's like hard to even boil it down into a concise explanation. And yet, when we talk about health, it's always diet and exercise. Yep. And so this narrative that we are personally responsible for something that is 90% something that is not diet and exercise.
You know, it's funny. I've been thinking a lot about the different certifications and stuff that I've done. And I know you've gone through personal training certification and Pilates instructor and, you know, gone through multiple personal trainer, group fitness instructor certifications. And I've been thinking a lot about the content of those trainings that we go through. And I can't think of a single one that has included anything related to the social determinants of health. And I don't know if I just basically like cracked the whole problem in the fitness industry in this conversation. But could you imagine if instead of really training not only fitness professionals, but anybody, health educators or teachers, I mean, anybody, like whenever we're talking about like facets of health and nutrition and movement and things like that, instead of zoning in on diet and exercise, what if we could flip the switch and immediately like start off with this social determinants of health diagram and say, look at this, people, this is what we need to be focusing on. It's so backwards. Like everything is very backwards of how we not only train people out in the world, but just how we view health from a personal responsibility standpoint instead of looking at all of these other factors that have so much more effect.
Absolutely. And, the problem is, again, this is not something that is just about health or food or exercise or any of that. Like, I think a great example of this is how we all went down this rabbit hole of like demonizing straws and like our individual use of plastic straws. And like, yeah, actually this is a great example of both and thinking too. Like, yeah, the environment would probably benefit from those of us who don't need to use a plastic straw, not using one. There's a lot of disability rights activists who talk about why eliminating straws and putting this on a personal responsibility level is very discriminatory towards disabled folks. And so there's that, which is problematic also. And yeah, those of us who can give them up, sure, it would be great if we did. But who's really responsible for everything that's wrong with the environment? It is not people who use straws. It is like these multi-billion, trillion-dollar corporations and all of their like environmental emissions and things like that. But it's better for the system if we believe that we are responsible for changing that, as opposed to holding them responsible for it.
It's easier to blame a straw than a CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company.
Right, and like worse, not even the straw, but ourselves for using the straw. Individuals for using the straw. I think that's a perfect example of like how this stuff plays out in other arenas too. Ditto for, the bootstraps myth. Like just do better, just work harder, just go to school, just whatever, instead of recognizing wage discrepancies and, access to schooling and just, so many things that affect upward mobility, that it's not just, well, put your nose to the grindstone and do it, you person, individual.
Yeah. Well, and I know we're talking about how diet culture is more than diets, but circling back directly back to diets, that's how they work. They make us feel like we need to start this very specific diet or weight loss program in order to achieve a certain body size or ideal. And then when it doesn't work, or when we go off the program or off the plan, or it fails to produce the result that we're looking for, it's our personal problem that we can't stick to this unsustainable program. It's our fault.
This is how these systems survive, by making us feel like we're the problem and keeping us distracted from what's actually the problem. So one of the things that I remember really sticking with me when in the intuitive eating book and in learning about intuitive eating, was how self-silencing of emotions and like self-silencing in general was linked to things like disordered eating behaviors. And that studies had shown that when young women silence their voices, they have a tendency to also start ignoring or suppressing hunger cues that are inconsistent with these societal ideas of thinness. And that expression of thoughts and feelings and needs end up being like this critical aspect of cultivating healthy eating behaviors, which was so fascinating to me, because I feel like there's like a direct link to that, to, that super famous Naomi Wolf quote about how dieting is the most potent political sedative in women's history. Naomi Wolf, who has also gone down a super problematic rabbit hole, but that quote still remains very, very true. And that the whole goal of diet culture is to keep us quiet and distracted and like so caught up in the problems with our individual selves and like why those things are bad and our fault, so blaming ourselves, that we don't have the energy or the wherewithal to, or the voices and like belief in ourselves to actually take action to change these systems at their root.
It really paints a picture of how diet culture literally wants us to physically shrink ourselves, and that is kind of like a metaphor for shrinking everything else about ourselves, like our minds and our ability to critically think about topics like this or to speak out on injustice and all of that stuff. And that's what the diet culture does. Like, it wants to shut us up. It wants to shrink us down to this minute thing so that we can't disrupt the system.
Yep, I think that's exactly what it is. And that's one of the reasons why when we talk about diet culture, we talk about it upholding, like both being a system of oppression and upholding these systems of oppression, right? Because it has its own ways of upholding those systems, and then it also has its own ways of like directly oppressing us. So, yeah. So one of the, I think, things that's sort of important, and we can, we've hinted at this a couple times earlier in the podcast about talking about the difference between autonomy and things that are not actually autonomous. How like dieting, sure, choosing to diet is totally up to you. And like, what is autonomy within the context of all of these like systems, right? Like, what is that? What does autonomy really mean when we look at it in the context of diet culture and other oppressive systems that diet culture is inherently linked to? I'm a big believer that it's not autonomous if it's impacting others. So that's the difference between being on a diet and talking to other people about your diet, or worse, trying to convince other people to do your diet. It's the difference between having feelings about your body and making choices about what you want for your body and commenting on other people's bodies and like making suggestions to them about their bodies. These are different things. One is autonomous, one is not. Super relevant, related thing that is not food and diet related: vaccines.
Yes.
Right? Or like mask wearing even. Like, okay, like it's not autonomy to choose not to wear a mask or get a vaccine because it has a direct, or it's not even that. Yeah, you can choose that, but then you have to stay home and just affect yourself. Like you can't decide not to do those things and also go out into the world and impact others with those choices. And because that's not autonomy anymore.
No, and that's taking away the autonomy of all of the other people around you.
Exactly.
Should you infect them.
Right. Like that's a big thing to recognize, is that like true autonomy versus when diet culture goes, it's autonomy. Is it affecting just you or is it affecting other people? The other thing that I think is important to recognize in terms of like true autonomy versus the diet culture version is the extent to which information and understanding, or like really informed consent, is key to true autonomy. So I would say again, like, yes, dieting is an autonomous decision, not diet talk, but dieting behavior itself, like being on a diet. And is it? Like, if you haven't learned about diet culture, if you haven't learned about all the systems that are inherent in upholding dieting behaviors and diet culture, if like you are unaware about how like the thin ideal upholds anti-blackness and like all of these other things, is it really an autonomous decision if you don't have all the information, or is it just a behavior that you are comfortable with because it's what you know?
That is something that we could really, I know we don't have a lot of time left today, but I feel like we'll say this all the time, that could be a whole podcast episode in and of itself, is what's the difference between continuing just to go on like you always have because you don't know any different versus taking the initiative to explore other lenses and other frameworks and other ideas. It's not autonomous if it's on autopilot.
I love the phrase informed consent, and I think it's a very common phrase, especially in the medical world, where like, if you're getting surgery, if you're having some kind of medical treatment, you have to sign an informed consent form. And that form has to tell you about like the risks, like the downsides of doing what you're doing, so that you can have all the information to make a truly informed, like to actually give consent. And I just feel like that's a model that we could all benefit from applying to so many other things, dieting being one of them. But again, it's interesting to see how there's this like give and take. Like one, it relates to dieting, and also it relates to so many things outside of dieting. Like if you think about food choices, workout choices, medical choices, like there's so many ways in which career choices is one that I think really stand out to me, or like school choices. Like maybe you don't, like not everybody needs to go to a 4-year university and get a college degree, right? Especially in the days of like massive student debt. But if it's presented to you as like the only acceptable, like societally acceptable choice, and you think it's your choice to go ahead and do it, but like what if you knew that you could also go to a trade school or get a job that didn't require any kind of degree, or that there were certifications out there that could help, like that there were all these other options that just weren't being presented to you. And so again, like really this practice of it's critical thinking, like you mentioned earlier, and just like questioning, why are we doing things?
I've been having a lot more in-depth conversations with other group fitness instructors, so people I know, people I work with, about this idea of being more of a non-diet, non-weight loss, non-body change focused fitness professional. And how that's kind of a radical idea in the fitness industry to not focus on body change, or to not talk about burning calories or burning fat or getting toned for the summer and that sort of thing. All these common, phrases and things that we hear in fitness messaging and fitness marketing. And it's kind of along those same lines as if we've been taught this one thing, this one way of teaching fitness, or training people, or whatever, but we haven't taken the time to consider that there might be alternative ways of promoting fitness programs and that sort of thing. It's been a big topic in my world lately of like exploring other options that aren't the old school Jane Fonda, Suzanne Summers, Weight Watchers way of promoting health and fitness, but instead of kind of being on this autopilot, do things the same way we've always done it, kind of learning and adapting to alternative ways of presenting this type of information. It's been a hot topic in my world lately.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that there is something here about how this relates back to self-trust too. Where like, I think oftentimes the thing that leads us down the path to start looking at other lenses and perspectives and options is because something about the path that we're on just doesn't quite feel right to us. But if we've been taught all of our lives that we can't actually trust our intuition and our instincts and our even things as simple as our biological cues, we don't necessarily see that feedback that we're getting as valid and worth exploring. We get this sense of like, no, it's better to just shut it down and go with the flow. And as a result, we make these decisions that like we call choices and we say are autonomous, but like aren't really. It's sort of the last thing that I think is helpful to look at in terms of like how diet culture warps this concept is the concept of community. But a lot of times people, and I see this in like commentary about Weight Watchers a lot, right? Where like the thing that people really like about Weight Watchers is the community. And what they're talking about is like the meetings that you go to get like weigh in and get diet tips, essentially. And I think I hear the same thing from people about, just going to throw CrossFit under the bus again, even though like I totally don't mean to, because I think this is true in all different types of arenas like this. And just for some reason now it's on my brain. And so it's the first one that's coming to me. So I'm sorry, CrossFitters. I swear it's not you. But the thing is that people are always like, oh, I love the community. And we look at these dieting and fitness groups as community. But when you look closer at them, I think more what you get are groups of people who do a lot of comparison and competition and call it community, where it's not actually about everybody working together or solidarity or anything. It's about, like, how did I do compared to you? It's about a bunch of individuals in one place having almost like parallel conversations, or if anything, conversations that can sometimes do harm to other people. So there's this concept called normative discontent. It's this phrase that was developed quite some time ago to refer to the fact that like women participate in so much body talk that it affects us as a society and our like dissatisfaction with our physical appearance and stuff. That it's so normal that there's a term for this, right?
Wow, I have never even heard of that term, but it makes sense to me. Like it is a normal. It's just normal.
Yeah,
it's weird to not talk about bodies and comparing body size and what diet you're on. Normative discontent.
Yeah, it's like, of course,
add that to my vocabulary.
Like, oh, it's just normal for you to be bad, to feel bad about yourself. Of course, you feel bad about yourself.
Man, that's like, just messed up. Why are we like this?
It's bananas. It's like fully bananas that this is just a known part of our society. Whatever. But I think that really comes out of this like false sense of community. This like not actually community-driven community that you find within diet culture. And I think that what happens is when that's the kind of community that you are used to being in because of diet culture, it actually impairs our ability to find true community outside of those things too. Whether that's, in activism or social justice or parenting or relationships or family or like so many other places where we would normally seek community. But instead, we go into those spaces thinking not solidarity and community, but like individual people who are just in the same place comparing and competing.
Yep, and that goes back to what we've already talked about is individualism and this idea of personal responsibility versus social determinants and all the other things. Yes, you are in a community in some of those settings, but it's more of this individual, how am I better than the next person? Or how can I compete with this person over here?
Yeah, like I think that we're like, oh, if we're all in the same place, it's community. And it's like, no, like community requires connection. And these kinds of structures primarily disconnect us from other people. So like, that's not community. That's just a bunch of people in the same place.
Yep. Just kind of sharing space, sharing air right now.
Right. Diet culture is kind of a big friggin' thing.
Yes, it is. It is more than just diets.
It's a lot more than just diets. And, that means, one, in order to divest from it, you have to unpack a lot of things. And two, that when you do the work to divest from it, it impacts a lot of areas of your life. And honestly, it has the potential to impact a lot of the world.
Yep.
That sounds like an overstatement, but I honestly don't think it is.
Divesting from diet culture isn't a check the box and be done sort of thing. It is one of those things that is a constant evolution of unpacking years worth of crap.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. It's this onion, and there's always more layers to peel back.
Yes.
which is why we decided this was the theme for our podcast, right?
Yes, it
is. Because I think it's really helpful for people to recognize all the benefits of doing this work, because it's not easy. And I think that can really feel like an obstacle to people. This is too much work. I don't want to do it. It's not worth it. And so I'm excited to keep exploring these topics and keep helping people to recognize that there's actually a whole lot of benefit. It's not just about like, oh, now I can eat ice cream. It's a much bigger payoff than that. Not that ice cream isn't great, because it is.
And if you are seeking community, if you are interested in having more of a conversation around diet culture and how it is more than just diets, shameless plug here, we would love for you to come follow us on Instagram at Satisfaction Factor Pod, where we'll be talking more about our podcast episodes, but it will also give you a chance to talk back to us and to let us know your thoughts on what we're talking about here on this podcast, and to connect with other people who are also interested in doing this type of work. So come hang out with us over there at Satisfaction Factor Pod on Instagram.
Yes, absolutely. We would love to hear from you over there. All right, Sadie, before we wrap up, what is satisfying you this week?
There is a discount grocery store, and they often have random food. Like sometimes they have food that's getting close to being expired, or like boxes that are crushed that you can't sell in a regular grocery store. It's kind of like secondhand grocery items, basically. And I like to go in there and just kind of browse around and see what kind of like different cool things they have. And in their ice cream cooler, they had all kinds of ice cream, or buy one get one free. It's like, sweet, I'm going to stock up on the ice cream right now. And I found an ice cream that I had never heard of before. And I bought it, and I brought it home, and I ate it, and it was the greatest ice cream in the world. And I actually shared about it on my Instagram stories, thinking that I found this really like cool, different ice cream. And apparently it's almost as famous as Ben & Jerry's, but it was Jenny's ice cream.
Oh, yes, Jenny's is like the best ice cream in the world.
Well, I just recently discovered it last week. I posted on my Instagram stories that I was like, I'm going to try this new ice cream. It was buy one, get one free, $2 for 2 pints of ice cream. And I had all these messages from people. Like, I'll post stuff on my Instagram page about intuitive eating and diet culture and exercise. Get no comments, get no response. But I post a story about Jenny's ice cream. I got more feedback from that Instagram story than anything else, of like, holy crap, I can't believe you got 2 pints of Jenny's ice cream for $2. It's $8 at my grocery store.
Yeah, that's nuts.
Well, it was really good. It was the most satisfyingly delicious ice cream I've ever had, and it was pretty satisfying to learn that I got a really good deal on it too. So that was exciting.
I have 2 follow-up questions to this.
Yes.
First, I am addicted to your Instagram stories, and I didn't see this, and so I'm wondering how that happened.
Oh,
I don't actually expect you to answer that question.
The algorithm.
Really, the important question is, what flavor did you get?
They only had 2 flavors. So they had almond brittle crunch or something like that, which was okay. But they had the gooey butter cake, and it was so good. I think I'm going to try to go back this afternoon to see if they have more.
Awesome. Yeah, that one is great. I am a huge fan of Jenny's. For the holidays this past winter, my husband actually bought us a 6-pack that we had delivered to the house of all their holiday flavors. It was worth every penny, of which there were not few.
I'm sure. Well, when people were telling me they were $6, $8, $10 a pint, I was like, what? Yeah. You need to go to Hopi and Company and see if they have any there, other flavors in stock.
I will have to make a trip. That sounds well worth it. Yeah.
What's something that is satisfying you right now?
That is an excellent question, Sadie. It's funny. I actually am feeling really satisfied right now about the fact that I am kind of working on a bunch of different projects that I'm excited about and that also feel like they align well with things that matter to me. And just, I think for a while I was like really, really going down a rabbit. Like I had like my head down, nose to the grindstone, and I kind of didn't feel like it was doing much for me. I was mostly just stressed out and tired. And right now, like I have a lot of work to do, but I'm really excited about the things I'm doing work on, and that feels really satisfying, especially in contrast. So,
yes, I'm excited to see everything you're working on. All right, well, that wraps up our episode for today. So be sure to subscribe, rate, and review if you enjoyed this podcast, because that helps us reach more people.
Awesome. Thanks, Sadie.
Thanks, Naomi.
I'll see you next time.